Thank you for being here. I'm Caroline Paske. I'm State Hazard Mitigation Planner, and over here with Stephanie Smith, your State Hazard Mitigation Officer. Sorry to call you out, Stephanie. So today we're going to be talking about the State Hazard Mitigation Plan that was approved by FEMA in 2023. This is available on our website if anyone wants to take a closer look, and it is, well, we'll find out. All right. So what is hazard mitigation? A lot of folks think about emergency response, maybe hazardous waste, but hazard mitigation is more about thinking about our hazards and planning ahead for how we can better live with those hazards. So our snow, our ice jams, our rivers flooding, fluvial erosion. It's adaptation, if you are familiar with the climate change adaptation mitigation verbiage. So adaptation is how we live better with these natural systems. How do we reduce our need to respond to a disaster because our people and our infrastructure are safe and built well for the environment that we live in. So in Vermont and across the nation, we have both state hazard mitigation plans and local hazard mitigation plans. Each municipality, they build their local hazard mitigation plan in Vermont. A lot of states have county plans, but here we have municipal plans. They are largely reflective of the state plan, but are focused on what's most important to that community. So I am going to talk about state planning, but I wanted to touch on local planning really quickly. In Vermont, we have a pretty good approval rate. Right now it's at 62.3%. That includes Burlington and some are higher densely populated areas, so it's a lot of the population. But we're constantly working on updating those plans with regional planning commissions and private consultants with FEMA funding. And so this is the current reflection of the map, but it happens every 5 years, so it's constantly changing. So why do communities plan? There's a number of incentives. I like to use the word wish list. So it's you put in your plan what you would really like to have your community do to be more resilient to hazards in case funding comes available, right? Because I think a lot of folks in local municipal governments or officials, all the funding came available after COVID-19 and they realized, okay, what do we spend this money on? If we're doing good plans, we know what to spend the money on. And so that's what this process is all about. It's a good opportunity to start building relationships with the stakeholders that need to be processed, those technical experts, the public, the people who are living these hazards and really understand what's happening on the ground. It also gives you access to hazard mitigation grants, like the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program or Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities Grant Program. It gives you a higher rate of state assistance through the ERAF program if you have public assistance grants that you are taking advantage of from FEMA after a disaster. And it also, there's a small text that says that you can adopt floodplain regulations if you have an effective town plan. So skipping right over this unless you really want to talk about ERAF, but this is a breakdown of the ERAF program and how if you take certain steps in planning, you get more state assistance. So state planning. In Vermont, we are all about planning in the face of climate change and natural disasters. Our priority hazards are fluvial erosion and flooding, but we have a number of hazards that I'll go over today. So our most recent plan is the 2023 State Hazard Mitigation Plan. We had a long process starting in summer 2022. Before that, applying for funding to do it. We launched the process. We are understanding our challenges in the state over the coming years, finding those solutions to those challenges that we're facing. We created the plan and now we're in an implementation phase. Here's a basic outline of the plan. So if you open up the plan and understand how to use it and how to refer to it, there's the executive summary, a planning process. So like really how did the plan come together? Who was involved? Our current capabilities. So this is looking at what does the state already have? What do local municipalities already have to implement hazard mitigation? What are we working with? Programs, policies, the different funding programs. Then we dive into what each of the hazards look like in Vermont. So I'll go through those in a little bit. We have a vulnerability summary where we're really looking at, if you were to put all these hazards together and really look at what are the themes in vulnerability, what are the cross-cutting issues, what are those? So you can find that in the vulnerability summary. And our mitigation strategy might be the most interesting thing for some folks. Just open up to the mitigation strategy and look at what we're going to do. And then maintenance and implementation. So how are we going to make sure that this plan is meaningful and effective going forward? Breakdown of our capabilities assessment. I touched on this a little bit. There's funding, tools and data, technical assistance available, regulations, and our forms of implementation. The map that you see here is one tool that we have for getting more funding to some of our smaller communities in Vermont. It's the definition for economically disadvantaged and rural communities based on income and unemployment. They get 90% cost share for some grant programs from FEMA. So within each hazard profile, we have a description of what Vermont looks like, our landscape, what are we dealing with. We look at how the hazards are ranked, what are our priority hazards, and then we dive into the details on them. I included a picture of what Panton did in their hazard prioritization process. I think that this is a really clever tool for the local level where you have folks just have a sticker and go and put it on the board about what they think is really impacting the community. It's interactive, it gets people to really think about it. So the hazard ranking process is based on how frequent the hazard occurs in the past and in the future. We're looking at the potential impact. So impacts to not only life and property, but quality of life. And we'll dive into that a little bit more. And this is what our tables kind of summarizing it all together looks like. It's brought together a number of stakeholders, technical experts, subject matter experts, and ranking what our potential impacts to the built environment, people, economy, and natural environment would be for each of these hazards that we look at. I'll go back really quickly. So you can see that fluvial erosion, inundation flooding, heat and wind, snow and ice, ranking down, that's the order of priority of hazards within Vermont. All right, so I just want you to be able to open up the plan and know how to use it for each hazard profile. So, because I can't tell you everything about it sit here today. So really when you open up the plan, you're going to see what the hazard is, a definition, what types of kind of subcategories of a hazard you might see within Vermont. You're looking at what areas are most vulnerable, history of past occurrences, so our previous disaster declarations, the smaller hazard events that have occurred, how likely it is to happen in the future, given climate change and other factors like development, and looking at our current capabilities and mitigation actions. We also, in some of the hazards, have a subsection that looks at the impacts of climate change on that hazard, where it's not just about increasing the hazard, so things like snow and cold, talking about the dynamic changes that are happening there. So when we look at vulnerability, we're really talking about, it is an asset, including people, exposed to a hazard, and what factors are making it so that they're more or less impacted by a hazard. There are some populations within Vermont that may be disproportionately affected by a hazard, and we refer to them as frontline communities, and we'll get a little bit more into that. And like I mentioned, assets include the built environment, people, natural environment, and economy. So high risk factors for people, what we're really looking at, and this comes across in our vulnerability summary in our plan. So those who have electricity dependent in home life support equipment. If they don't have electricity, what's going to happen? Isolated residents, rural residents, can group those together. People with access or mobility differences, are they going to be able to evacuate as quickly as other folks? Our BIPOC populations, older adults, people who are pregnant, those who are immunocompromised or living with chronic health conditions, unhoused individuals is an increasing issue. Our residents in manufactured or mobile homes are often located in very vulnerable locations. Outdoor workers working in the heat, children, and people lacking the economic and social resources to adequately prepare, adapt, and recover from a disaster. So some of the themes that we're seeing in infrastructure impacts are damages to our infrastructure. So electrical, water, transportation, and communication infrastructure all are heavily impacted by disasters. This also impacts our buildings, our municipal buildings, our commercial buildings, our businesses, residential buildings, and industrial buildings. And we also have to think about the environmental impacts of some of that. So there's cascading impacts to our ability to heat and cool our homes, the power for life support equipment, like you were mentioning, travel, the ability to receive emergency assistance for those emergency vehicles to access folks, our access to drinking water, or maintaining a functioning home or business. We have impacts to the natural environment, including tree health, water quality, soil, and overall ecosystem balance is a huge thing when it comes to climate change. We're seeing a number of cascading impacts. In the economy, very much tied to natural environment, tourism impacts because people might not want to come after a disaster, impacts to our fall color because of different hazard impacts. Impacts to agriculture. So if a farmer is not able to maintain the necessary conditions for their livestock, they can't access feed. All these issues have come up in the disasters that we've experienced. Impacts to our forestry products, thinking about invasive species and other impacts, and impacts to the supply chain, as everyone's very familiar with after COVID-19. So touching back on people and community, we really try to emphasize in this plan the impacts of hazards, not only when it comes to death and injury to a person, but also their quality of life. So how do we really measure the impact of a hazard on somebody's mental health, their ability to maintain their quality of life, their, everything that, all the nuance that happens with a person's day in terms of getting to school, everything that happens is impacted by a hazard, and that is not going to be captured in measuring just how many people were killed by a hazard. There's a number of cross-cutting issues in terms of hazards. So, for example, heat may increase our risk of wildfire. So that's also captured in the plan. All right, I'm going to dive into each of the hazard profiles. I know that we're waiting till the end for questions, but if anyone has any burning questions, feel free.
Just note that it will be on the record and posted on our website.
Yes, good point, yeah. So fluvial erosion within the state is our #1 hazard. This is when the river moves. So this is a map of our river corridor, which has been carefully mapped out by the state. So you can see the area that was within the special flood hazard area in red. And then you can see the area that's the river corridor. So that's the area where the river might just carve out the side of the river, and it might not even be in the floodplain. So it's a huge risk in Vermont. It can undercut homes, businesses, roads. Inundation flooding, we can see this both from our rivers, as well as at the lake or any of the waterways in Vermont. So the water overflowing its banks and impacting an area. Extreme heat really increased in this last plan. We're seeing that this is really sending people to hospitals. It's a huge impact. This map is looking at the vulnerability across Vermont in terms of heat, and the areas that are darkest are actually really surprising. So there's a number of factors that are going into that. Wind, even a single tree, it doesn't look very impactful. It can really interrupt a person's day, their ability to run their business. This is a wind event in Middlebury, and we're constantly dealing with down power lines, a loss of electricity, impacts to transportation. Snow, everyone's pretty familiar. Has anyone experienced snow here? Ice, of course, has a huge impact on our infrastructure. It can weigh down power lines. It can make driving very hazardous. It can freeze over roads, make them inaccessible. Drought. So we are very familiar with rain recently, but drought is also a hazard that we can deal with. You can see it here. I'll use the pointer. So in the 60s, we had really bad drought conditions. We've had a few spikes since then, but largely we're getting a lot more rain, as you can see down here. But that doesn't mean that this can't happen again. So it's something that we also need to be planning for, and the impacts that that'll have largely on infrastructure, or largely on agriculture and other infrastructure. People who have shallow wells and that sort of thing. Infectious disease outbreak within our plan. So this is a map of the Eastern equine encephalitis virus, but I took its most recent map. So these are the areas that we need to be concerned about for EEE. This is something that is also discussed within the plan, and something that we need to plan within the spectrum of hazards. Cold. So with climate change, we don't have to worry about cold anymore, right? It's not going to work that way. So there's actually instances where we'll experience more extreme cold because of instability in the jet stream and in developing science there. We will continue to experience cold and the dynamics of that, and it has huge impacts on our population, especially if it's combined with other hazards like loss of electricity or some other hazard that makes it so that people can't stay warm. The unhoused population's hugely impacted by cold, as everyone's familiar with. Invasive species, here's a picture of garlic mustard. It's like my nemesis right here. Emerald ash borer. They have huge impacts on our natural environment and the stability of our forests, our infrastructure, and our agriculture, and we need to be planning for those as well. Landslides. Everyone's more familiar with landslides now. This is Ripton. These folks got out on time. This is going to be a buyout eventually, but we need to be aware that landslides are possible and the impacts that it can have on our homes and our people, our infrastructure. You can see that trees were removed up here, and there was a lot of changing the landscape up here, and we need to be planning and prepared to determine our land use based on the risks, including landslides. Wildfire. I include this map. Doesn't really, like Vermont is in here. You can see that wildfire is a pretty low risk in Vermont, but also still something that we want to be planning for as we're experiencing more heat, potentially more droughts. It's something that we still need to be planning for, because we do have a history of wildfires. We just haven't had one in a really long time. And so something to plan for. Earthquakes, also pretty low on the spectrum of hazards, but still the potential is there. You can see us over there. So in terms of what we invest in Vermont, it's pretty low. We're focused on flooding, fluvial erosion, heat, but it is something that is in the plan. We're aware of it. We're documenting that risk there. And hail. This largely impacts agriculture. We also need to be aware of our impacts on our homes, et cetera, but pretty low down. This is a picture of hail netting that actually at Champlain Orchards that they're using to keep birds off. So there's dual uses if folks want to prepare for hail, and something that is in the plan as well. Okay, so the goals of our plan and our hazard mitigation strategy. We break it up into environment and natural systems, built environment, plans and policies, and education and outreach. We want to protect, restore, and enhance Vermont's natural resources to promote healthy and resilient ecosystems, enhance the resilience of our built environment, our towns, infrastructure, buildings, and cultural assets, develop and implement plans and policies that create resilient natural systems and built environments, and create a common understanding of our coordinated approach to mitigation planning and action. So this is what's informing the mitigation actions that we come up with in the plan. This is what our mitigation strategy looks like. If you open up the plan, you can take a look. It's actually an Excel spreadsheet that you download separately. And so we have 112 mitigation actions in the 2023 State Hazard Mitigation Plan. 43 of those are priority actions. So what we want to implement because they are going to have the largest impact and they're feasible. And then there's 10 top priority actions, and those were selected by our partner agencies as what they want to implement first, their priorities. So priority actions within environment and natural systems, we have developed an inventory of critical headwater and floodplain storage areas that would result in a measurable abatement of flooding, and that's with DEC. Develop a drought plan for Vermont to use as a predictor of drought and rates of recovery with UVM. Develop a wildfire mitigation plan to address long-term future risk of wildfire due to climate change and wildfire mitigation options, and that's with Forest Parks and Recreation. Within the built environment, our priority actions are support municipalities in developing transportation infrastructure improvements that increase resilience using protect and other funding sources. So that's with VTrans naturally. Increase public service department capacity to maximize utilization of available federal dollars and a number of programs that came out after COVID towards utility resilience implementation work. And that's with our public service department. So that those are actions that they will be leading. Under plans and policies, we have assessed all state funding, technical assistance, and permitting programs to determine areas for better alignment around hazard mitigation priorities. So how do we really align our existing programs to be supporting each other and figure out where the gaps might be? Identify sustainable long-term funding to support local match and hazard mitigation activities that are not eligible for FEMA funding. So we had created the Flood Resilient Communities Fund to fill a gap in FEMA funding. That was funded with ARPA dollars and hopefully will continue. That was with VEM. Complete an assessment of heat risks in urban areas of Vermont and expected impacts on historically disadvantaged populations, and identify strategies for mitigating impacts, and that's with our Department of Health. In terms of education and outreach, we're looking at develop a methodology and protocol for quantifying climate mitigation, resilience, and adaptation impacts. And that's with the Climate Action Office as lead. And sorry, the text is cut off. Develop an analysis of existing resilience hub locations and identification of key components that should be co-located within a resilience hub. And VEM is working on that with the Department of Health. And so we are hoping that we can get some of these projects funded and move those forward. All right, here's my contact information. I guess we're ready for questions.